Here in Florida, these little lizards are everywhere. Right now it's springtime, so they're shedding their skin. Looks like this guy is almost finished with that. This is something I've been putting off for a while, but the shocks and struts on the Jetta are completely worn out. The car floats like an old Cadillac, and the suspension bottoms out every time I hit a speed bump. I was originally going to do the front strut and rear shock replacement all in one video, but I forgot to buy bump stops for the rear shocks. So now we have a separate video for the rear shock replacement. If you haven't seen the strut replacement video, there's a link up in the corner. I replaced the front struts with quick strut assemblies, which made the job easier. But I couldn't find anything like that for the rear shocks, so I bought all the parts separately. I'm going to replace the shock mounts and the bump stops, in addition to the shocks. Anyway, let's get to work. First, I'm going to put the wheel chocks under the front wheels. I'm also going to put the transmission in gear. Then I'll jack up the rear end and put it on jack stands. And of course, the wheels need to come off. Removing the shock is surprisingly easy. There are just 2 bolts on the top and 1 on the bottom. No special tools required. I'm going to remove the bottom bolt first. With the car up in the air like this, the shock absorber is holding up the weight of the rear suspension. So I'm going to put a jack under the suspension to take the load off the shock. Then I'll buzz off the nut with an impact driver. After both shocks are disconnected, you can let the suspension droop. That'll give you more room to install the new shocks. Just be mindful of the wires for the wheel speed sensors. If they get too tight, you can detach them from these clips. Now I'm going to remove the top bolts. And that's it. The shocks are out. That was easy. Here's a close-up of the old shocks. Man, those bump stops are gross. But the dust boots look good, so I'm going to reuse them. Of course, this means I need to disassemble the old shocks. I'm going to use the same trick I used on the front struts. I'll use vice grips to hold the shaft while I buzz off the nut with an impact driver. Looks like the dust boot is friction fit onto the bump stop, so I'll pry it off. Okay, let's get the new shocks ready to install. Here you can see the difference between the old bump stops and the new ones. Like night and day. Anyway, installing the dust boots onto the new bump stops is pretty easy. There's a lip near the bottom of the bump stop, and there's a notch in the end of the dust boot. You can push the lip into that notch with your thumb to get it started. Then give it a twist. By the way, on the old shock you can see the hydraulic oil was leaking out. Anyway, let's assemble our new shocks. First I'll install the bump stop with the dust boot on it. Then I'll install the shock mount and the top nut. I'm not going to use the vice grips on my new shocks because I don't want to damage the shaft. So I'm going to try to hold it by hand and give it a few braps with the impact driver. Last but not least, we need to push the bump stop up into the shock mount. I decided not to use any lubrication because I don't want it to come back out. So getting it fully seated took some effort. Okay, this is the point where you would torque the nut, but I don't see how I can do that. I can't put a crow's foot on the nut because it's recessed into the shock mount. And I can't put a hex key in the end because it has a tab on the end to hold with a wrench. So I gave it another brap with the impact driver and hoped for the best. When I went to install the new shocks, the bottom part didn't want to fit. I had to file it down a little bit on both sides. I'm not sure if this is a common problem, but I only had to file off a little bit of material. It only took a minute. Anyway, let's get the shocks installed. I decided to install the top first. I put the bolts in hand tight. After we get all the bolts installed, then we can tighten them all. Then I used the floor jack to line up the bottom hole and installed the bottom bolt. And that's it. Torque the bolts to spec and you're done. Oh, and if you disconnected any wires, remember to reconnect them. Here are the torque specs for the bolts. Replacing the shocks and struts made a big difference, but that's because the old ones were completely worn out and I put off replacing them for a long time. Anyway, I'm gonna go enjoy the car now. Hope you enjoyed the video.